Good noon, everyone, and welcome all to this IC about the pediatric keratoconus. So, I am very thankful to the All India Ophthalmological Society and the Scientific Committee Chairman, Dr. Partho Biswas, for giving me this opportunity. We know that the pediatric keratoconus is very much different from the adult keratoconus in many ways. And today we have some knowledge about how to deal and diagnose this type of the pediatric keratoconus. For that, we have the distinguished faculties from all over the country to enlighten us with this their knowledge. They are the renowned cornea surgeons and expert in their field. So without any delay, we start our IC. Our instructor are Dr. Vikas Mittal, Dr. Ashish Nagpal, Dr. Sital Mahuakar, and Dr. Alisa Desai. And today's our topic are early clinical diagnosis and evaluation of the comorbidity in the pediatric keratoconus by Dr. Alisa. Be a master in imaging modality for every detection of progression in the pediatric keratoconus by Dr. Sital. Then various modality of cross-linking and management difficulties in pediatric keratoconus by me. Surgical modalities of management in pediatric keratoconus by Dr. Ashish, and the Bowman's stromal inlay, another option in keratoconus management by Dr. Vikas. So, is Dr. Alisa is there? Dr. Alisa?
Not yet, ma'am. I think the first talk would be by Dr. Sheetal or by you. In the meanwhile, they shall join in. Because I'm trying to reach Dr. Alisa, Dr. Ashish, and Dr. Vikas Mittal.
I think I can take up my talk because it's on the diagnostic modality.
Yes, Dr. Sital, you are welcome. Dr. Sital is a renowned cornea surgeon. She done her fellowship in the phacoemulsification cornea and ocular surface fellowship from LVPI. And at present, we are working as a senior consultant, cataract, cornea, and refractive service, Retina Foundation, Ahmedabad. Welcome, Dr. Sital, and please start your presentation.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think, yeah, you need to, I cannot share my presentation. I think you need to stop sharing your presentation. Yeah. Okay. Is my presentation visible? Is my presentation visible?
Yes, doctor, you can get started.
Yeah.
Am I audible? I'm sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So my topic for today is be a master in imaging modalities for early detection and progression in pediatric keratoconus.
Come in.
Yeah.
So
I have no financial interest. So before getting into my presentation, I would like to just say that we are going to answer these questions. Why is it so important to diagnose a pediatric keratoconus? Why early detection is important? Why should we follow up regularly pediatric keratoconus? What factors should we consider to call it a progression? And how do we read maps on the topography? So basically, we all know that the prevalence of KC in pediatric population is 0.16%. That is a pretty high prevalence for any disease. And the visual impairment caused by keratoconus can affect social and educational development of a child, leading to a bad quality of life for them. Unfortunately, this side of the continent has much more prevalence and incidence of keratoconus compared to our Caucasian brothers. At younger age, the KC progresses very rapidly, and also it is the stage at which it gets diagnosed is pretty advanced. Now, why the children have more aggressive keratoconus? Because they have a higher rate of corneal collagen remodeling. As we know that biomechanical rigidity of the cornea is inversely related to the age. As we grow older, there is a natural cross-linking which happens. Also, VKC and allergies are much more common in childhood than in adult agehood. So, the childhood keratoconus may not halt on its own. Now, by Leone et al., they have done one study and they found almost 28% of the pediatric age group had stage 4 KC at diagnosis, vis-a-vis to just 8% in adult age group. Also, 88% of the pediatric keratoconic patients progress. That means almost 9 out of 10 pediatric keratoconus coming to your OPD are going to progress. So that is a pretty high rate of progression. Now, unfortunately, there's no global consensus on what we call it as an ectasia progression, but the panel defined progression by consistent change in at least 2 of the following parameters. Number 1, steepening of the anterior corneal surface, steepening of the posterior corneal surface, thinning of the cornea, or changes in the pachymetric rate of the change. And these can be seen over the serial topographic maps. Now, by various papers, progression is defined as a deterioration of the best corrected visual acuity, that is loss of 1 or more lines of Snell's chart, Kmax of more than 1 diopter at 1 year follow-up, and pachymetry of more than 10% at thinnest point, decrease in pachymetry. Now, when we call it treatment failure of CXL, because most of the children are going to undergo CXL as it's a progressive disease for them, the Kmax of more than 1 diopter, but lot many authors do feel that it should be 1.5 diopter over the preoperative value. So after knowing that why we need to do it, we need to know now how to read these maps. So then only we can keep a tab on the progression as well as the early detection. So these are the main topographers we use in our practice. I'm going to talk about Pentacam and Cirrus because these are the 2 topographers I have used mainly in my practice. So this is a Pentacam 4 map. As we can see, we first have to see the qualitative check. Then Bellin intuitive color bar is used for curvature and elevation map. Absolute normal scale for pachymetry, because this is useful for the for keeping a tab on progression instead of normalized scale. There is 75 micron scale on the elevation map. Now, why we use all these things is because if we use 150 micron scale, it may mask the posterior island. So when we start reading a topography, we need to know a basic thing about a topography, what we are going to read and what scales are we going to use. Also, the optical zone, what we use is a 9 millimeter, which is generally mentioned over here. But if we use bigger than that, it does not give us any additional information, and it in fact makes the map very confusing with all the extrapolated data. Now, this is a typical 4 map of Pentacam which we read. It shows the anterior sagittal curvature map. The Cirrus gives us a tangential curvature map in the 4 map, anterior and posterior elevation map, and the pachymetry map. Now, on the left hand side, if you see, it will give you curvatures of the steep and flat meridian, Kmax, and a lot of information about pupil also, and the thinnest pachymetry and Q value. Now, curvature map, we have axial and tangential. Axial gives you a global view, so it differentiates a diseased cornea from a normal one, and a tangential is more accurate, represents more actual curvature. So it gives you it is used for the pattern recognition. We all know that there are a lot of topographic patterns which are there. Some are normal, like round oval. Some are abnormal, like superior steepening, inferior steepening, irregular, symmetric and asymmetric bow ties, skewed axis, or bow ties with non-skewing of the axis. Now, pachymetry map is again important to see whether your central and the apex and the thinnest point is with each other, or they're displaced away from each other, because in normal person they should coincide or they should be very close to each other. In ectasia, it will be displaced, thinnest point will be displaced. Now, CTSP and PT are the things which gives us, basically it gives us the information about the change in the pachymetry value from the thinnest point towards the periphery. Elevation maps are basically what Pentacam uses is the best fit sphere. It is calculated over 8 millimeter optical zone. Now, why 8 millimeter? If we take a smaller optical zone, it gives us a steep BFS, so it can mask the subtle cones. And why not larger optical zone? Because it unnecessarily counts a lot of this thing, and it will give you a lot of flatter BFS, and it can accentuate unnecessarily central normal cornea as a steep cornea. So in elevation map, Pentacam uses and gives the cutoff values for best fit sphere measured over the 8 millimeter, and these are the cutoff values for suspect as well as keratoconus. Now, Pentacam has something known as enhanced best fit sphere. So what normal best fit sphere does is it measures all the points, all the portion of the cornea, including cone over the 8 millimeter. So the resultant BFS in keratoconus is slightly steeper, so it can unmask early cone. What enhanced BFS does is it actually excludes the point 4 millimeter from the thinnest point, a circle around 4 millimeter circle around the thinnest point, and they exclude those points, and then they measure the best fit sphere from the remaining points. So the resultant best fit sphere is little flatter, and it can accentuate the early cone also. It will not do the same or not make any difference in the normal patient, because for normal the best fit sphere and enhanced best fit sphere will be the same, unlike keratoconus. So this is the concept of BAD-D display. This is what they use in BAD-D display. The first two are the anterior and posterior elevation map with the best fit sphere. The middle is with the enhanced best fit sphere, and this is the difference. And these are the cutoff values which are given for this. So it basically BAD-D display basically helps us to diagnose early keratoconus. The red flags on Pentacam are the inferior irregular steepening, anterior elevation more than 12 micron, posterior elevation more than 18 micron. And in the end, all these points, the thinnest point as well as all these points should coincide with each other. Then only we can diagnose it as keratoconus. So many a times you may have very early signs, but you see that all these signs are matching together. They are at the same point, and we can call it as keratoconus. So now this is what we have seen, the BAD-D display. On the right side of this map, there are all the other indices of pachymetrization, like your CTSP PTI, which gives you overall the profile of the thickness, what is happening to the thickness from the thinnest point to the periphery. In the end, it gives you the different indices like anterior elevation change, posterior elevation on the change, pachymetry progression, absolute thinnest point, and the displacement of the thinnest point. These are the indices which are given in the Pentacam. Other indices are also there, but we mainly look into the 4 maps, the BAD-D display and the pachymetry maps which are given. Now for progression, what do we do? For progression, we can actually compare 2 examinations or 3 examinations. You have to match the pupillary center for the proper comparison. Now you can get to know the K-max, the difference between the steepest K, the difference between the thinnest point, and it also gives you the areas of steepening without corresponding areas of the flattening. So it basically gives you the difference between these 2 maps. Now in serous, what happens is it gives you a keratoconus summary after the 4 map. The next map which you need to study is the keratoconus summary. On the left hand side in serous, they will consider the indices like your SIF, SIB, BCB and the thinnest point. On the right hand side, it will give you the anterior elevation, posterior elevation, CTSP, PTI, and the last image is the points which are of these things. So all these points, if they are gathered together, it is indicative of keratoconus. If they are straddled away, it does not, it means it's not basically an ectasia case. So there are differential maps, comparative
I'm really
maps.
sorry to interrupt,
I'll
ma'am,
just
but-
take 1 minute, yes.
Yeah.
Comparative map and keratoconus follow-up map on serous. So this is an example of a case where the curvature maps look pretty normal, but the thickness, there is a little displacement of the thinnest point and a small posterior island, even in the same case. So this could be a case of early keratoconus, and we need to serially follow up this case, whether it is increasing. If it is a child, we need to see whether he has any associated conditions, and we need to diagnose and maybe go ahead with the CXL. This is a case where you can actually see the inferior steepening on the curvature, but the elevation maps seem to be normal, but the machine gives it as suspect keratoconus. If you see these notable points, they are straddled away, so it may not be a case of keratoconus, and it just shows as keratoconus because of a thin Pachy, which was something like 460 or something. But if this was a child, I would still follow this up case and see whether it is progressing or not. So to summarize, basically 4 maps, indices and clinical examination have to be correlated. Areas of steepest curvature, highest elevation and thinnest pachymetry should coincide for diagnosis of keratoconus. BADD gives you better clue for early detection of ectasia. We should do topography in children with history of rubbing eyes, high cylindrical power, family history of ectasia or associated systemic condition to rule out early keratoconus, and regular follow-up with serial topography should be done once there is suspicion of KC, as ectasia progresses much faster in children. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sital, for this wonderful talk about the understanding of the Pentachem and their use in the pediatric keratoconus. If is Dr. Alisa is there now?
Yes, ma'am, I'm there.
Yeah, so please start your presentation.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, we can see your presentation.
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, ma'am, for the delay. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So today, with this really interesting case, IC for pediatric keratoconus, what I'm going to be discussing is the early clinical diagnosis, how ASOCT may help us in the early diagnosis, and comorbidities of pediatric keratoconus. So I have no financial disclosures. Pediatric keratoconus is different from adult keratoconus. It presents at a later stage of the disease. It doesn't present early. The progression is explosive in nature because the biochemical rigidity of the pediatric patients is less. It is inversely proportional to age. It is commonly associated with systemic and ocular diseases, of which, of course, as we all know, VKC is the most common association. And PKP in advanced keratoconus in pediatric cases has worse prognosis. This is why we need to catch this early. To understand what are the comorbidities, let's see what is the etiopathogenesis of keratoconus in keratoconus, basically, especially in children. There's a 2-hit hypothesis in which the first hit is genetic, which you are born with, and the other is the environmental factors which may precipitate keratoconus, like eye rubbing, atopy, allergic conjunctivitis associated with rhinitis, with dermatitis, floppy eyelid syndrome, though not very common in children, contact lens wear, UV exposure and geographical location. We know that keratoconus is so much more common where in desert areas, in the Middle East, in India, and of course hormones. As we know, it may increase in pregnancy and even thyroid disorders. And it is found that keratoconus people also have typical personalities, or at least that's what they say. You can't prove this, but they say that the keratoconus people have slightly neurotic personalities also. So these things basically, and these comorbidities are what we are going to discuss just now. So genetics, family history is known in keratoconus. It is known to have an autosomal dominant penetrance with incomplete penetrance, and much more than autosomal recessive. It is associated with about 20 genetic syndromes, of which I'm not going to go into the details of. And of course, consanguinity. There is a 4 times higher risk of consanguinity leading to keratoconus in the child, especially higher if the first cousin is married, if first cousins are married to each other. So let's talk about the ones that we can make a difference to, like VKC. In the acute case, VKC, of course, VKC has a much higher risk of eye drops as compared to primary keratoconus. Short-term management is with topical steroids pulsed. We may rarely need oral steroids, especially in a case of a corneal complication. Dual-acting antihistaminics and mast cell stabilizers like olopatadine and bipotastine that we are now using. Surgical management in these acute situations may include a supratarsal steroid injection, the giant papillae excision, and shield ulcer treatment we are all aware of. So VKC also has comorbidities, and of course keratoconus, LSCD, limbal stem cell deficiency, steroid-induced cataract, and steroid-induced glaucoma in children, which can be blinding. So a routine dilated fundus evaluation is absolutely necessary, and the treatment for cataract and glaucoma must be done. In long-term treatment for VKC, basically, I would like to talk about this a little bit, is where basically we use cyclosporin, topical tacrolimus, as well as sometimes methotrexate may need to be used. And monoclonal antibodies like IgE antibody omalizumab has been used in very severe cases. I'm going to take a second for immunotherapy. So immunotherapy is basically allergen-specific subcutaneous immunotherapy or sublingual immunotherapy, in which, because atopy is associated with inherited predisposition to exaggerated immune response, we try to desensitize or hyposensitize the person. So we identify the allergen with a skin prick or a patch test and do either subcutaneous or sublingual immunotherapy by giving increasing doses of a specific allergen to induce tolerance. This may be a good idea in atopic individuals and in recalcitrant cases. However, in the systemic review, it has shown to help in ocular symptoms, but not shown to be a steroid-sparing therapy. So this is important to note, that just because we send the patient to an allergy specialist, it is not going to be a steroid-sparing therapy. Another very, very important association that we are all aware of is eye rubbing. Nearly 50% of the patients of keratoconus report eye rubbing. So why do they rub? Because of course the itch. Unusual personality traits, as I've already mentioned, they are associated with compulsive behavioral psychosis, associated with syndromes like LCA, which have ocular digital sign, and of course Down syndrome, where you can't control the eye rubbing and it becomes a habit. It might even be an unprovoked habit, like a tick, like somebody licks their lips or somebody scrunches their eyebrows. Similarly, it is also known that it may be relaxing because of vagal stimulation, because of the ocular cardiac reflex, inducing a relaxing bradycardia. And this is another reason why people may rub. So eye rubbing is a difficult habit to break. So even once you have treated the allergy, once you've removed the itch, it is a difficult habit to break. So patient education and rapport, and creating that rapport with the child as well as the parent, is very important. Behavioral modification approach has been used quite successfully for habit reversal in keratoconus eye rubbing. So basically we make them aware of the habit, create competing responses. Like when you feel like rubbing your eyes, rub your nose or wash your eyes or put a cold compress. Motivation to explain to them that eye rubbing will worsen your vision for the future. Social support, like family has to be supportive, and of course keep on each visit doing the compliance. So keratoconus management related to pathology is that we do immunotherapy, reduce the IgEs, give mast cell stabilizers, antihistaminics to reduce the itch, behavioral modification for the eye rubbing, and of course topical steroids and immunosuppressants to reduce the ocular surface inflammation. So this is the multi-pronged approach to how we would approach keratoconus management of allergy. Now, of course, it is very easy. We know all of these signs to diagnose on the externally as well as on the slit lamp, like the Munson sign, Rizzuti sign, Voges tri, which disappear on pressure, the Fleischer's ring, corneal thinning, prominent nerves, apical scarring, and of course the retroillumination signs. But these are not early signs. So what are we going to talk about? So when we talk about the early signs, I think one extremely important sign is the scissors reflex, which comes really early on and a good optometrist can find it. And also compression of Meyer's on an autoref. My optometrist usually comes and tells you, ma'am, please do a pentacam for this patient because, you know, there's a little bit of compression of Meyer's, even if the Ks are not very raised. So steep Ks and compression of Meyer's can be a idea on it that you can get on an autoref. So as we know, pediatric keratoconus and adult keratoconus are different. They present later and have a progressive nature of very progressive nature. So we need to diagnose this early, ideally in patients with normal best corrected visual acuity with minimum or no signs. And this is a big challenge. So we should do mass screening for early diagnosis, especially in allergic eye diseases, in correct geographical areas where we expect this, in patients with Down syndromes, with family history, and of course in school children with myopia and myopic astigmatism. And we can use all of the screening tools that we have at our disposal. For example, if a 13-year-old child comes with a change in glasses in the last 6 months with this refraction, not much astigmatism, refracting to 6 parts, of course, we'll do a pentacam. So normally in our daily practice, we do a pentacam or a topography to rule out keratoconus. So in the first, just in the topography here, we are seeing that, yes, there is a superior inferior mild asymmetry. Of course, in the bad, the keratoconus has been caught. But say this patient had come to you 3 years ago with just a mild allergic conjunctivitis and a myopic astigmatism. He may have had normal topography. So then, even though topography is currently the gold standard to evaluate ectatic disorders, it does not capture all the cases at risk. So here, basically, as you can see, that the patient has a subclinical keratoconus is where, I'll just go to the next slide to just show you that keratoconus is easily diagnosed. This KC is easily diagnosed. But subclinical keratoconus, where it is form fruste or suspect, is where we are finding it difficult to diagnose early and treat early. Topography has its limitations and does not differentiate ectasia from contact lens induced warpage, scarring, uneven tear film, lid artifacts, and other corneal distortion. So topography may not detect all the cases. Pentacam does add the fact where it correlates pachymetry in the map. So early pathological changes in the cornea are displacement of the thinnest part of the cornea, changes in the epithelial cell layer distribution, anterior-posterior corneal astigmatism relationship, and a variation in the corneal thickness from the central cornea to the periphery. So let's try and use these with the OCT to diagnose keratoconus early. So corneal thinning in keratoconus is focal and asymmetric. As you can see here, there's a global thinning in a thin cornea, which is normal, and an asymmetric focal thinning in keratoconus. Basically, let's see how OCT can help us with the diagnosis of keratoconus. In this study, for example, they have divided the cornea into octants, and they have used 5 pachymetric parameters to diagnose focal thinning and asymmetric thinning. So focal thinning is the difference between the median and the minimum and the median. The minimum pachymetry is used to diagnose focal thinning, and asymmetric thinning is, I'll just take one more minute. Asymmetric thinning is the difference between the inferior superior, between the inferior temporal superior nasal, and the vertical location of the minimum vertex. So any cutoff outside 1 percentile of normal is basically considered diagnostic. If there is one abnormal parameter, it has a 0.97 sensitivity specificity. And if there are 2 abnormal parameters, it has a 1 specificity, and it is at least as sensitive as the Kisa index. So keratoconus risk scoring system is done similarly, where there are scores given if you are more than 20th, 50th, 5th or 1st percentile in these 5 pachymetry parameters. And if your risk is 0 to 3, means not really falling into the 1st percentile, you have a low risk. And if more than 4 is the high risk of basically having keratoconus or progressing to keratoconus. So my question was still that, is OCT helpful in diagnosing pre-topographic keratoconus or early keratoconus? To answer this, we need to do some epithelial mapping. Corneal epithelium remodels in response to the stromal irregularities. As you can see here, basically this is a corneal.
I'm really sorry, ma'am. If you could sum it up in the next 30 seconds, that would be...
I'll do that. So as you can see here,
30 seconds.
Yeah, this topography would still be normal because the epithelium has compensated for the corneal thinning. So basically, they have also tried to do pattern standard deviation maps to diagnose epithelial thinning. And in these maps, you can see that although the pachymetry map is not showing too much of a variation from normal, the epithelial thickness map is really picking up the variation in the pattern standard deviation map. So basically, why is epithelium better at picking up the problems? Because the focal thinning is much more easily detectable because epithelium is thinner. Epithelium is only 50 microns of the corneal thickness of 550 microns. So 5 mm of thinning responds to a 10% change in the epithelial thickness, but only a 1% change in the pachymetry. So that is one way to find out the early keratoconus. Bowman's layer breakage seen on ultra high resolution OCTs that of course we don't have access to might be one of the futuristic modes. And another futuristic mode is a polarization sensitive OCT, in which because the corneal collagen lamellae are very nicely organized lamellae, it gives us a very normal birefringence. But in keratoconus, these lamellae become distorted, and that gives us an abnormal birefringence. So changes in...
I'm really sorry, ma'am, but we will have to conclude, ma'am.
Yeah, I'll just conclude. This is my last slide. The pathogenesis of keratoconus is changes in the microstructure, changes in the stromal epithelial thickness, then corneal steepening, and then we see the clinical signs. So our aim, if it is to diagnose it early enough, we can't just use a slit lamp and topography. We need to use the ASOCT and eventually the PSOCT. So we need a lot more normative data, algorithm formations, and basically diagnosing pediatric patients early enough to prevent long-term complications is the goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alisa. It's a wonderful talk and how to diagnose the early keratoconus.
Thank
We
you.
know more, but time is limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay. Now, I think it's my lecture. Can you see my screen? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Okay.
You can start your screen sharing again, ma'am.
Yeah. 1 minute. મારું લેક્ચર તો આવતું જ નથી.
Dr. Upal?
We can start with the lecture of Dr. Ashish.
Yes, we can have Dr. Ashish
Yeah.
going in next. I would request Dr. Ashish if you could start your screen sharing.
Okay, I'm audible.
Ashish, timer reset कर देना. Sorry, Dr. Ashish, you can start your screen sharing. Karan, please timer reset कर देना sir के लिए.
How much time do I have? 10 minutes?
10 minutes, sir.
Okay. My timer started. Okay. My screen is visible?
Yes, sir, you can go ahead.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Rupal. I think I'll quickly go ahead with my presentation. I think for pediatric keratoconus, I think the whole concern is about how early can we diagnose. I think Alicia has given us nice tips. So that is the concern. So earlier we detect it, the better, because that is what is different. Because the pediatric keratoconus, if it usually tend to present at a much advanced stage and they have a very fast progression. And of course, they are associated with many other comorbidities different from adults. So, what are the surgical options? I mean, we have already gone through the cross-linking, which will be discussed later. But suppose now it's at a stage where it requires some surgical intervention in form of a keratoplasty. So I think these are the current options that we have: penetrating lamellar, and now we're sometimes looking at Bowman's, hoping that it may offer a less invasive option. So the first choice for me in these current times would be a lamellar keratoplasty, a DALK in these children. Why? I think we'll just discuss. I think we all already have an idea about the two major advantages of having anterior lamellar. We know that there is no risk of endothelial rejection. And second important thing is we are preserving the anatomical integrity of the eyeball, which is very important because these children are being grafted at a young age. And just for the example, this was a young 15-year-old boy whom we had operated with a DALK for keratoconus. He had been using lenses for many years as well. Finally, with both eyes, we operated him. He had a very good outcome. It was a large diameter DALC. And after 6 months, he came. He called that he's had a problem and needs to see urgently. His mother called. So what had happened was at school, one of his benchmates had hit him with his elbow in the eye, and this was the picture that he came with. So you can see the whole graft dehiscence had occurred, but fortunately, being the DALC, even I was surprised when I took him on the table. I wasn't sure, but it was well preserved. The desmoid was pretty strong, holding up, and we could suture it back. Eventually, we also operated his other eye, and but surprisingly, this eye has got unaided better vision than the other eye as well. So importantly, the anatomic integrity is very important concern over here as well. Apart from this, in pediatric keratoplasty, there are many general concerns for any pediatric keratoplasty. One is that you would need good and excellent quality tissue, general anesthesia. We are expecting a smaller globe size. Although, in my experience, we haven't operated very young children, so they are usually around their puberty, around 12 to 16 years of age is when we have done. So we have not faced that much of an issue which you face of a lower scleral rigidity as you would face in a younger age group. But other comorbidities need to be managed well, because they would come with, usually they would have associated VKC, they may present with high drops, so you would be looking at managing them better. And of course, we have to be aware that keratoconus is associated with certain ocular conditions and systemic conditions. So this is just a list of them, just to keep in mind, so that whenever you are at that stage, you should rule that out, because it may be important both for the surgeon and the anesthetist. So these are the tips for penetrating keratoplasty. So you would need a well-controlled anesthesia, maybe a massage, not on the cornea, mannitol and Freirenga ring. That should help you for a penetrating keratoplasty. But having said that, even because some of these patients have very large, obviously these patients which are operating have very advanced cones, and they would need a large diameter graft. And again, in children, doing a large diameter PKP, as you would know, would attract a higher risk of rejection. So again, this is one important reason which we would prefer to do a DALC, but because sometimes you may even do a smaller graft, but then you may end up with what may be known as secondary keratoconus or ectasia later on, much later, because you have not covered the ectatic cornea. So with DALC also, the concerns would be similar, but the chances of increased viscous pressure are less. Usually you do not need mannitol. Other things may be needed by the surgeon intraoperatively. So this is just a case, a representative case. Sometimes they may have a scarring either because of contact lens wear or because of some repeated epithelial issues, and sometimes it's difficult to know whether there was a hydrops earlier and it has scarred. So in these situations, the OCT may come to your aid and may guide you, because some of these patients may actually not have had a hydrops. So sometimes it helps us define whether there's a deeper scar or not, and then plan accordingly whether you want to do a PKP or not. So just few tips. This is an unedited video. I'll just move forward. So here we have already kind of isolating the cone, marking it, checking it. We have already marked it on the slit lamp before the surgery with a small nick. So that is important, as I mentioned, because you should cover the cone area. You can mark it with the ink as well, so that when you are doing guarded trephination, it covers that area very well. This part of the procedure is very important, because sometimes if the trephin slips a little bit also, it would go away from the area which you had thought of. So you should take time doing this part of the procedure. And then usually in these cases, my personal choice is to do a manual dissection. I do not do a big bubble in younger children. I like to go, and these are pretty elastic corneas, and they seem, if you spend time doing it, you can go pretty deep. So here we have just taken off the antiestromal layer, And now we're just removing the desmase from the donor. And just go ahead, and this is so important thing here is the suturing has to be interrupted. Do not take continuous sutures whatsoever. So rest would be similar for both the procedures, and you should try and make sure that you bury the knots properly so that you can remove it easily. This is the post-operative outcome after almost 3 to 4 months. So now post-operatively, what is different? So what is different is that it's a rapid wound healing. You should expect early suture removal. Maybe you may need to take it again if it comes off very early. Interface vascularization, especially with concurrent VKC. And at the same time, with all this, you need to be aware that you need to monitor the IOP because that becomes a task, and sometimes you're not able to. So make sure you keep a note and keep checking because they would be on steroids as well for a pretty long period. And of course, coordinate so that you keep removing the sutures as early as possible. This I've just included a long list. I'm not going to discuss it of both which are common for both PKP and DAL. There are certain complications which are unique to penetrating keratoplasty. There are certain complications unique to DAL because I'm not covering this because there can be complications of a rupture of a DM and how do you manage that. So I'll quickly skip to the last procedure. The new kid on the block is the Bowman's layer transplant, which has been shown in the last 5 to 8 years to show some promising results. But this is a mid-stromal isolated Bowman's transplant devised by the Mellis group. And they have shown, so I'll quickly go to the outcomes. So the harvesting is the key actually. This is the most difficult part of the procedure because to get a good Bowman's takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, very thin Bowman's because then that's when only it would be visually good. This is just a quick video and a array from the NIOS, how they have put the stained Bowman's inside. It's a pretty simple procedure once you have the Bowman's. So surgically, it doesn't seem to be a difficult procedure, so to say. So you just need to put it in the mid-stroma and expand it. So I will not go into the details, but this is, it doesn't have results for pediatric keratoconus, so it still has to prove itself. And last year, the group has also proposed an onlay version of a similar procedure, which may make it much more simpler, much more safer. So we look forward to maybe doing that in the future. And I'll leave you towards the end. Having discussed all about LK, this is a patient of ours whose one eye was operated by PK by Professor Kaleva in the 1980s when he was 10, 11 years old. We had operated his other eye with a DALC. Although he has some amblyopia in the PKI because it was done much earlier. But this is just to show the graft survival, as you must have also seen, is sometimes over 20-23 years as well. So these are the few things which you need to keep in mind, which I had gathered together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Assis, for wonderful surgical videos and nice talk about how surgical manage the pediatric keratoconus. Now I think I can start my presentation. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. You can see it.
Now I am talking about the various modality of the cross-linking in the pediatric patient and how to deal with some management difficulties in this age group. I have no financial interest. As from the previous speaker talk, we already know that the pediatric keratoconus is behaving differently from the adult keratoconus, and there are so many unique characteristics like the severity of the disease, progression of the disease, corneal rigidity, less biomechanical rigidity. This is most important because it affects the outcome of the cross-linking, association with the allergy, eye rubbing. So the treatment modalities available for the pediatric keratoconus is same as the adult, but it is very important in the pediatric group that treat the underlying pathology and hold the progression of the disease. That is most important. And the corneal cross-linking is the only true treatment for the progressive keratoconus to hold the disease. So before going the cross-linking, we have to keep some point in our mind that the timing of the treatment in adult, we usually do the cross-linking after stamping the disease is progressing, but it is not true for the pediatric. So do not wait for the sign of progression in pediatric patient. Then management of the associated allergy or inflammation is most important. Eyes should be quiet before no sign of surface inflammation before the cross-linking. And of course, the counseling of the parents about the various parameters like the disease is progressing even after the CXL and retreatment may require. Frequent follow-up is very important. And of course, visual rehabilitation even after the treatment is most important. The cross-linking in the pediatric population was started in 2011, and standard Western protocol remained the most widely used cross-linking procedure till date. Because of the low biomechanical rigidity of the cornea, the accelerated cross-linking and the transepithelium cross-linking is still under the investigation. There are so many literature or published literature available about the safety and efficacy of the standard cross-linking. The most important one in the Vinsegura and the Kaporos studies, because it has a large number of the group patients and the long follow-up up to the 3 years. And they conclude that the standard cross-linking is safe and effective method to stop the progression of the keratoconus. And Soeters also says that there is a more corneal flattening and more visual acuity improvement in the children as compared to the adult after the standard cross-linking. The Megley and Busonetti compared the standard cross-linking with the transepithelium, and they conclude that transepithelium cross-linking is not effective in the pediatric group. But all the studies, they says that the standard cross-linking are very good for the pediatric eye, but they all have a maximum follow-up up to the 3 years. The long-term study done by the Hedsey and Hafezi shows that the pediatric keratoconus show the progression after the 36-month or the 3 years follow-up, even after the standard cross-linking, which was not reported into the adult patient. And they conclude that the higher rate of corneal collagen remodeling, persistent eye rubbing, and the presence of the vernal keratoconjunctivitis may be responsible for the continuation of the progression of the disease in the children even after the cross-linking. Although the standard cross-linking is gold standard, but it has its own negative point, like it requires the epithelial scraping. It has a very long treatment time. So sometime in the pediatric group, we need the general anesthesia. There is a more postoperative pain, more stromal haze which lead to the late visual rehabilitation, and the vision threatening complication like infection may be possible. So between 2016 to 2019, the multiple other cross-linking procedures have been studied, like accelerated cross-linking and various modality of the transepithelium cross-linking. The accelerated cross-linking is comfortable to use in the children as it is a significantly reduce the treatment time. There are many studies, but it was first studied in 2014 by Dr. Sethi. And there are another 8 studies between 2014 to 18. They all conclude that the accelerated cross-linking, so a stabilization and beneficial clinical outcome in the pediatric keratoconus. It seems an effective and safe procedure in this age group, but we have to keep in mind that all studies have a very short-term follow-up, and long-term study is necessary to evaluate the efficacy and risk spectrum. The transepithelium cross-linking has been reported as a very easy technique in the children because it is a no-touch protocol. There is a no epithelial scraping required, so you can do it under the topical anesthesia. There is a reduced postoperative pain, no risk of infection, and less stromal haze. Various modalities of transepithelium cross-linking like conventional, accelerated, or iontophoresis all are studied for the pediatric age group. The only difference between the conventional transepithelial cross-linking and the standard gold Dresden protocol is that there is no corneal epithelial scraping is required. All the other parameters remain the same. And there is some change in the riboflavin solution that contain the trimetamol and the sodium EDTA, which enhance the penetration through the intact corneal epithelium. The three studies, they studied the conventional transepithelium cross-linking in pediatric. They says that the conventional transepithelium cross-linking is less effective as compared to the epi-off cross-linking in the pediatric patient, and most children progress after the some period. Only the Magley reported there is a no statistically difference in the efficacy between the standard epi-off and the standard transepithelium approach, but there is no long-term data is available. Then Henrique that studied the transepithelium accelerated cross-linking for the pediatric age group, and he used the riboflavin that contained the 0.25% riboflavin, 1% at HPMC and the BAK, and administered it every 5 minutes for 30 minutes, and then he used the UVA radiation that is 18 millivolt for 5 minutes. He concluded that there is no statistically significant difference in the various parameters between the conventional transepithelium group and the accelerated transepithelium group. But there is a reduction in the endothelial cell count following the accelerated cross-linking is seen. And we have to keep in mind he is using the 18 millivolt in the children. Now, the only disadvantage of transepithelium cross-linking is there is a very less penetration of the riboflavin in the stroma. So there is a less efficacy of the treatment. So iontophoresis is used to increase the penetration of the molecule through the intact tissue. And the Buzonetti studied the transepithelium cross-linking with the iontophoresis for the pediatric patient. He used the riboflavin without dextran with trimetamol and EDTA, and the iontophoresis performed for 5 minutes, followed by the UVA radiation. He used 10 millivolt for 9 minutes. And he concluded that the transepithelium cross-linking with the iontophoresis give all the advantages of transepithelium treatment without compromising the treatment efficacy, and it is safe for the children, but still the further long-term studies is necessary. So from all above, we conclude that the data overwhelmingly support that the transepithelium procedure has fewer complications and perfect method for the children. But the standard epi-off protocol hold the progression of the disease better in the pediatric keratoconus. However, neither procedure has been found to completely hold the disease for long period in the pediatric keratoconus. Now we come to the management difficulty. We know all this difficulty, that is under diagnosis or late diagnosis, poor compliance, high rate of progression of the disease, short-term effect of the treatment, management of comorbidity is most important, and the modification of the treatment may require. The another some difficulty is the choice of the anesthesia. So according to the patient age, mental status, and the cooperation ability, either you can choose the general anesthesia or the topical anesthesia. But if you are using the accelerated method or the transepithelium method, you can do it under the topical anesthesia. The one important point is the limbal stem cell damage. The study says that there is oxidative nuclear DNA damage can occur in the layer of the corneal epithelial cell at the limbus through the cross-linking. And to avoid this, in the adult, it is very easy to proper fixing the eye, but it is require the person cooperation, and it is very difficult in the children to maintain the fixation. So one can use the limbal protection ring, and now the newer machine have a tracking device which constantly monitor the fixation. And the recent one and most easy one, that is the sleep lamp mounted cross-linking. We all know that it is very difficult to take the child into the operation theater and make them sleep for the 1 hour. So if we do the procedure in the OPD with the on the sleep lamp with the presence of their parents nearby, it is very comfortable. And study also says that by using the comfortable sitting position and providing a red fixation light on the slit lamp, the patient was able to fix it more easily than the supine position. And this device is now available, of course, not in the India, but it is available. Treatment of the VKC, we all know. And visual rehabilitation is most important for the pediatric age group. And after the treatment, cycloplegic refraction and the proper prescription is important. Okay, 1 minute. Frequent follow-up, use of contact lenses above the children above the 14 years of age, and the parent counseling that patient child wearing the glasses is most important. Post-operatively, we have to take care about the microbial keratitis, epithelium healing. You can require the patching of the eye in the children for the proper epithelium healing because they are frequent eye rubber. And the so my take-home message is the cross-linking in the pediatric population is new field with a promising result and good safety profile. The cross-linking should be considered at the time of diagnosis without waiting the documented progression. Till that, the standard resident protocol remain the gold standard for the pediatric patient. But the newer cross-linking procedure shows a promising result. But further studies is required to check the safety and efficacy of the procedure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for finishing it on time. Can we have the next speaker to start the screen sharing?
Yeah, next speaker, Dr. Vikas.
Yes, yeah. I'll start my screen.
Yeah.
So can you see my slides?
No, we can see you, but not your slides.
Okay, I'll try it again.
Yeah, no.
Visible?
You can see.
Yeah, it's visible.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Dr. Shah, for this wonderful opportunity. It's a nice IC going on keratoconus part, and this aspect of pediatric keratoconus, that maximizing the visual potential, has already been covered to a large extent by Rupal. That in kids we need contact lenses, we need scleral lenses, and amblyopia management is very important. So most of the visual rehabilitation for pediatrics, you need a pediatric ophthalmologist. So what we generally do is we collaborate with our pediatric ophthalmologist, and most of our pediatric keratoconus patients, after either cross-linking or keratoplasty or anything, they take a pediatric ophthalmologist opinion also, and he's the one who manages with for the visual potential. So what we thought for this aspect, we would cover another aspect of keratoconus, that is Bowman layer transplant. Alicia had shown in her slides that Bowman layer is fragmented in keratoconus patient, and Ashish showed that Bowman layer transplant can be a good thing, a new thing on the block for the management of keratoconus. So I'll take you through this and our technique of using a Bowman layer transplant. So I'll start with this case. This was a 20-year-old boy who had progressive keratoconus in right eye. He had undergone penetrating keratoplasty elsewhere 3 years back and was not very happy with the vision, mainly because of the high astigmatism. Although with contact lenses, vision was good. So he wanted a consult for right eye, and he was not interested in any suture transplant. This was a tomography image. As you can see, it is typical keratoconus, where the K readings are close to 65 diopters, 66 diopter, and pachymetry was close to 300 microns. So what options do we have in a 20-year-old boy with progressive keratoconus, nearly 300 microns cornea? We need to stabilize the disease first. And as Dr. Rupal Shah also mentioned, that if you have a less than 400 microns cornea, it becomes very challenging to do a collagen cross-linking. So a patient was not interested in any PKP or DALK. So what other options we have? Ashish showed you that Bowman layer transplant started by MLS group. They have found a very good outcome in the form of stabilization of keratoconus as well as some flattening. And the rationale was, as Alicia showed you, the Bowman layer is fragmented in these patients, and if the main resistance by the Bowman layer goes away, and they say that if you transplant a new Bowman layer, it can ensure the resistance to the ectasia, and that can also lead to some flattening. So as you can see in this long-term study, the K also went down and it was stable in most of their eyes. This is surgically challenging, specifically the creation of this Bowman layer, and they have reported, I think, close to 15% where they had failed and had to defer. The other aspect that has been shown is stromal augmentation. That has also shown, there are 4 or 5 very good studies where what they have done is that the stromal lenticle which they removed while doing SMILE, they had transplanted it into the keratoconus cornea by creating a pocket using femtosecond laser in the mid-stroma. And what they found was a decent outcome. They found both flattening as well as stabilization, but most of the studies, they had a follow-up of close to 1 year. So what we did was we combined these two techniques to make a Bowman layer transplant, an easy, technically very easy one. So what we did was, from the donor cornea, we removed anterior 200 microns using a femtosecond laser, which has both Bowman layer as well as anterior stroma. In the recipient cornea, we created a pocket at 300 microns and transplanted this inlay that we have created into this mid stroma. Because it has both Bowman layer as well as anterior stroma, we called it Bowman stromal inlay. So I'll take you through the surgical steps. So first of all, the patient eye is docked and we are creating a pocket. So what we had done is the same LASIK flap software has been used. What we did was the side cut energy was reduced to 0, and the canal which is used for the release of air bubbles, that was increased in the bread, and this will be used for transplanting or implanting this inlay inside the cornea. So this is patient's eye or keratoconic eye. So this is creation of 130 micron flap. This is now donor cornea. So we have made these changes. So what we are doing is 200 microns we are using. First of all, remove all the epithelium. It is very important to remove all the epithelium by using alcohol. So marking the limbus so that the centration is good. Then it is dogged, and 8 millimeter diameter and 180 to 200 microns depth. This is anterior stromal graft which has been harvested and placed in BSS. Now patient is transferred into main OR, center is marked, and this pocket which has been created is opened by any blunt dissector. So once this whole pocket, and it is very easy, just like we open this. Now this is the inlay which is placed in IOL injector with Bowman layer side up. And this pocket is open, just I'm instilling a few drops of BSS, engaging the tip of the IOL injector and then injecting this inlay into the mid stroma or the pocket which has been created. And it is very simple. You can use for unfolding, you can use your cannula, just like, and it can be centered well, just like we do our DSEC graft, and same way you can center as well. So it is centered to the pupil irrespective of where the cone is. So now we have this Bowman as well as anterior stroma into the mid stroma of patient's eye. First postoperative day, generally patient have some edema, but after 1 week it is absolutely clear, and sometimes it is very difficult to find the interface, although interface looks somewhat like a LASIK interface. You can see the inlay well placed in the anterior stroma, and the patient who had this close to 61 diopter. So you can see this is 300 microns pachymetry increased to close to 500 microns. And what we found these were the first 10 patients that we analyzed. All had keratoconus. One patient had post-LASIK ectasia. All were mild, moderate to severe keratoconus with a mean K of 56 diopters, average pachy close to 380 microns. And all patients, it was surgically very easy. It's not complicated at all. And there was no specific intraoperative complication, be it stria or haze or cellular reaction. And there were no such issues that was failed. Mean corneal thickness was increased, and this increase was as per the thickness of inlay that we had chosen. The BCVA was more or less same, although it improved in I think 4 or 5 patients. Contact lens assisted visual acuity was same in all. Topo as well as subjective astigmatism reduced a bit. Mean steep K also got reduced, and posterior float remained stable throughout. So overall, there was stability that was achieved over a period of now. These patients have finished, I think, 2.5 to 3 years old, and there has been no progression. And there was flattening, and flattening also was achieved in patient who had more severe keratoconus. This technique was recently published in JCRS. We also had one boy in which one eye was BS inlay, other eye was cross-linking, and both were stable. and the patient's eye in which there was Bowman stromal inlay, that got flattened significantly. So what are the possibilities? If you have a transplant of Bowman layer as well as stroma, you are strengthening the cornea. So there will be a stabilization of keratoconus for sure. So it may be an alternative for cross-linking in cases where you can't do cross-linking, or as per se also it can be a safe alternative to cross-linking. You can also achieve flattening later on, since if instead of 300 microns you have 500 microns, later on for visual rehabilitation you can do a topo guided or wavefront guided surface ablation. And in case it progresses, cross-linking is always possible. We didn't cross-link these inlays. Most of these inlays we have, what we did was, these were donor eyes were more than 40 years. So these were already naturally cross-linked. So we thought that we wanted to avoid haze. So that's why we didn't use cross-linking in the first go. But we can, in case it happens and the ectasia progresses, we can always do a cross-linking. So overall, this is another management option for keratoconus for corneal surgeons. The results may be similar to CXL, and we always have can ensure that the visual rehabilitation is done with a future laser treatment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas, for excellent surgical video and the elaborating talk about the Bowman's transplantation. I think it is a very promising treatment for the keratoconus, particularly with the thin cornea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question for Vikas.
Yes, Sheetal.
Yeah, because in your cases, did you ever find this problem of upside down Bowman?
So initially I was very much cautious. So I think one patient we couldn't make out whether it was upside down, but later on we were very sure. We wanted to ensure that it is, it remains on the upper side only. But if you see, it hardly matters. There are people who have done even at 150 micron. There are people who have done at, I think Meles group only, they had even manually dissected somewhere around 180 microns. What most of our, initially we had done it at, I think 170, then we ultimately settled down at 130. So even if it is upside down, I don't think it should matter, unless you are doing some other customization in it, which we are, developing.
Is there any way, once you have done the dissection, to recognize, the way like in our DMEC?
You can mark, yes, you can mark. So what we recently started doing is we mark on the inlay so that we just can center. So far the marking is done for the centration. Generally, we had done, I think 7-8 wet labs before starting it. And in those, we found that, it was not upside down. Another way to see is edge. So generally edge angle, we don't take 90 degree. We initially took 90 degree, but these days we take 45 degrees. So 45 degrees, you have more of Bowman layer and less of the angiostoma edge. So there also you can see that which side is good. But to me, I think it hardly matters if the Bowman layer is upside down or not.
Amazing, both of you and Dr. Ashish. I think wonderful techniques.
What was the diameter maximum that you could go with the femto?
So this was also an issue. So initially what we did was we saw what is the diameter of patient's cornea. So generally we dock the patient cornea first. Most of the time we get close to 9.5 easily. So the diameter of tunnel is 9.5. So if the diameter of tunnel is 9.5, the inlay will take close to 8 or 8.25. So now after a lot of hit and trial, we have settled down at 8.25. Unless sometimes, the cornea is also, the diameter are low. So we can't go beyond 9. So in those cases, we can take 7.75 or 8. Most of our patients now are 8.25 diameter of inlay.
What was the diameter in your case, Dr. Ashish?
In Meles group, they want as big a diameter as possible. So as much as you can go. So they feel that there's a stretching effect is more if you can get it. So it's up to you, whatever you can get based on your.
Yes. You see, if you have done it
manual dissection, I think you can go as wider as you can.
It depends.
The only thing is that you need to have that much tunnel, right?
Yeah.
So that is important.
Would
And
that
Ashish
actually matter, because you are anyway pushing it inside as a folded thing, the way we put your apna DSEC or DMEC thing. So it would not really matter the tunnel.
Yeah, see, no. See, if the overall pocket is 9 millimeter, and you take 9mm only. So sometimes,
No, I'm talking about both the dissections as manual, not the femto. If you'll have to do manual dissections, I think, if you take the wider one.
Manual dissection, we didn't do manual dissection in any. I was talking to Dr. Reddy. He had done a few manual dissection. The only thing is, you can, like in Melis, Ashish also had shown that in Melis group they had punctures also. So if you do a manual dissection, you can buffer it also. So I don't know whether it is a good idea, but for femto it is fantastic. Ashish, you mentioned that taking this Bowman layer is very challenging. Have you ever tried it in any time in the wet lab?
Yeah. I mean, I've done a few. To get a thin one is extremely consistently. You can get a Bowman's with some stroma very easily. The thin, the way they get it. And even in the Melis group, the lady who's the researcher, she has been doing the harvesting. She is the only one who does it in a proper one. So they, and as you said, there are a lot of the cases that we choose are thin. So there are more chances of perforation. So it's a catch-22. So if something like a laser can do it, it's far better, more reproducible. Even if it goes with some stroma, I think it's better because this would require a different set of skill.
True. I think that is the reason. If you see the Bowman layer transplant is only from Melis group, and he has shown. I think first publication was close to 7 years back.
Yeah.
So not everyone around has accepted because it's because of this challenge only.
Dr. Vikas, I had a question.
Yes, Alicia, please.
Dr. Vikas, what happens is that what I've seen is Dr. Melez used a scleral tunnel to put in the graft. And I've seen somebody in South India do the same. However, they had a lot of vascularization from the tunnel into the interface. So I think this is an excellent idea to go through the cornea. So I was inhibited to using it because of that scleral tunnel. But I think the cornea and doing it from the cornea is, I think, a fabulous idea. Second thing, sir, do you think it makes a difference if we just transplant the Bowman's? Or why is Melez not taking the advantage of a little bit of extra stroma for thickness and better contact lens fitting post surgery and need for like an RGP versus a scleral lens? All those things would be, I think, more beneficial if you took a larger graft. So do you think that there's a specific reason why they're taking only Bowman's, maybe for visual rehabilitation, better visual rehabilitation or something?
So I think they have started with Bowman layer only. And contact lens fitting doesn't matter at all. Generally what happens if you're using scleral lens, suppose, you have 64 diopter. So even if 64 diopter becomes 62 diopter, hardly matters.
Yes.
So it's not that, they didn't notice in any of the cases that the contact lens fitting became easy. They found that the best corrected visual acuity became better in a few patients. But their goal also was a stabilization. Primary was stabilization. This was an add-on value that they've got. So what I think is we tried it as Ashish tried. We also tried it in Levetta. What I found it is not consistent. You have to get that Bowman layer alone. It's very cumbersome once you do it. So that's why I thought that why not take some NTS stroma also. If you remember, in early days, we used to do lamellar keratoplasty for keratoconus also long back. So and we never saw that they started getting progressing. So I just thought maybe NTS stroma is then again more cross-linked, more strong. So maybe take some NTS stroma also. And then you have maybe recently we did one PRK for a girl who had undergone BS inlay 3 years back. So that option is always there.
And even if that PRK can't remove the whole number, at least it can improve the topography.
Yes, absolutely. The way we do TGPRK plus CXL, the same way. So you can at least smoothen it a bit.
Dr. Alisa, I have some question for you, Dr. Sita.
Yes, ma'am.
So what is your experience with the use of anterior segment OCT, particularly the epithelial mapping for the early diagnosis of the keratoconus?
Honestly, my OCT doesn't have an epithelial mapping software. So I cannot map the epithelium. I don't think most of our anterior segment OCTs don't have that software. So the commercially available ones don't. But this is probably going to be the future. I think Dr. Rohit Shetty is doing a lot of work with the epithelial mapping. Yes. So I read a few of his papers also, and I've been in conferences also, I've heard him talking more about epithelial mapping, especially to diagnose early regression or post-LASIK ectasias. And like that, we should be able to diagnose early keratoconus. So honestly, I have no experience, ma'am, because my ASOCT doesn't map the epithelium.
But hopefully it is a very good technique if it
Yes,
is
ma'am.
available
Hopefully in
to
the
us.
future.
And also, Dr. Alisa, when you use the systemic immunosuppression to treat the comorbidity?
Ma'am, systemic immunosuppression, I have seen it being used a lot in my fellowship, ma'am. So very bad LSCDs related to VKC, very bad limbal stem cell deficiencies.
Is useful for the pediatric patient particularly?
I'm honest, I don't have much idea about the pediatric patients, but I do have.
Pediatric,
Yes,
yeah.
ma'am. Even in a few patients, I have used methotrexate when I feel now this VKC is becoming limbal stem cell deficiency, or it's just not, abating with the topical treatment and is completely dependent on Elpred, and Elpred is causing a glaucoma or something. So, or Predfort, or basically, so those are the cases when low dose methotrexate, like even a 2.5 milligram, maybe you start with a 7.5 milligram, but even a 2.5 milligram once a week sometimes can really make a big difference in the progression of the VKC, of the limbal stem cell deficiency because of the VKC. So there is one place where I really feel like using it. I have one young girl who had started cyclosporin on, given her one this thing, but then she has not returned. So when
So we have so many patients that have a stem cell deficiency due to the chronic VKC, and
Yes.
even after doing the cross-linking, they have a very difficulty to re-epithelialize. So these patients are very difficult to manage.
Yes.
So,
And-
madam, in those cases, you can do BS inlay.
Yeah.
And regarding this point, Alisha just mentioned, see, immunosuppression we are not giving for LSCD.
No,
Immunosuppression we are giving for VKC.
Yes.
And Alisha will agree that cyclosporin is far better in these VKC kids. So we recently, I think for the last 1 year or so, 1.5 years, so we use a lot of systemic immunosuppression along with steroids. So if I see a shield ulcer, bad papillae, so the first thing I'll do is go ahead with the systemic steroids. And the kids, they tolerate these systemic steroids very well, and they respond very well. Only when you see that recurrences are really bad, then you plan to start cyclosporin right from day one, so that within 3 weeks you switch off the systemic steroids, carry on with your cyclosporin and whatever small topical medication you can give. And you are right, we see patient has a really bad glaucoma. Sometimes they, even with the fluorometholone, they respond so badly. Those cases, I think the cyclosporin is a bliss.
I think I agree with because the immunosuppression, and sometimes we do have to start systemic immunosuppressions. And my choice is also cyclosporin. I have few patients who are on systemic cyclosporin. I think the LSCD or the vascularization decreases not because you have started them on systemic immunosuppression. It's just because you have a good control of your VKC, and not because of that drug per se.
No, I completely understand that.
Dr. Vikas, I have one question. I experienced that in my few patients, after cross-linking, there is some infiltration at the edge of that marking of the, how can you treat that infiltration?
Ma'am, these are sterile infiltrates. Do you use contact lens?
Yeah, after.
So I had this contact lens related sterile infiltrate 12, 13 years back. So after that, I stopped using bandage contact lens altogether. So all my cross-link patients, they are patched. And the reason is these are not routine corneas. These are like 50 diopters, 52 diopters, and you place a normal routine bandage contact lens. So what happens is it becomes tight. And the chances of having hypoxia and chance of having these sterile infiltrates are high. But again, if you see an infiltrate, please scrape, rule out infection. So for me, every infiltrate is infective unless proven otherwise. So, but these infiltrates are generally sterile infiltrates.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
I would also like to ask that after C3R, after how long do you feel that the refraction really does stabilize, or the corneal pachymetry comes back to its original? Because I have had 2 patients recently, for 6 months, their refraction has been changing. For one person had a haze, and it healed with a unfortunately poorer topography than what he had previously. It was a progressive keratoconus, so we had to do a C3R. So now, in fact, he was refracting to 6.6 parts and then was refracting only to 6.9 after the haze. So I'm just wondering, when does everybody sort of give their final glass prescription after a C3R?
So what we generally do is we tell them that after 1 week, start using your own glasses. We tell them that this is the only one you should use. Most of the patient, they do fine, and then we generally after 6 weeks or so we refract again. If there is significant change, then only we change. Otherwise, we tell them or encourage them to use same glasses. In case the patient is using contact lenses, again here we wait for at least 6 to 8 weeks, because that time take for the epithelium to mature. So we tell them after 6 to 8 weeks, go ahead and use contact lens. So it's rare that you have to change your contact lens findings substantially after cross-linking. Glasses, yes, it does change, but that again generally after 6 weeks, 8 weeks you change, and we tell them for next 6 months to 12 months it may keep on changing, because the cross-linking effect keeps coming delayed, and you cannot standardize it. So every patient behaves in a different way.
Yes.
So that is generally SOP for at our center is 6. You start using your own glasses. After a week, start using your own contact lenses after 6 weeks, and we tell them that you keep on coming after 3 months. Keep refracting. If there is any change in glasses, we give them.
I think I'm refracting too often. Yeah. Maybe I'm refracting too
You-
This is the main problem, frequent follow-up and
No need.
often.
Ashish, what do you do?
Yes, so I tell them 3 months, not we'll change glasses only after 3 months. So yeah, that does happen, because see, when they come, you do a topo, that will also show thinning.
Yeah.
Refraction is haywire, and then if he is a smart guy, he will check and he'll feel it's increasing, decreasing. It wastes too much time to 3 months.
Yes, I think
I same
that's
and one from Dr. Ashish during my training with him. 3 months.
3 months.
But as you said, some of them, sometimes when you look at initial 1 week, you get an idea. Some, as we know, as Vikas was saying, each cross-linking patient is different. They respond differently. Some may keep on flattening for a year. Some may be fine after 3 months, 6 months. So that would vary. If you know that you have seen more haze, you expect that maybe this guy is going to go on for longer than 3 months.
any participant question from chat box? No, I think.
Great, great IC, Dr. Rupal.
So can I ask a question? So anyone, have you ever repeated the cross-linking in any child? So did you have to repeat, and if so, what was the duration?
Yes, I have.
Ashish,
Once, I think. Yeah.
once. So do you remember that child? So what happened? At what age did you give?
It was almost, we had done his cross-linking in 2008. I think it was almost after 10, 11 years. Yeah.
But that would be something which is required, right? After 7-8 years, you do expect that they might need, because the whole
That's
collagen turnover has happened.
So earlier the concept was of only one cross-linking forever, for life. But I think last few years we realized that the effect wears off and it's possible.
Yes, I have
In
3
fact, in
patients.
children,
I have one patient. Yeah.
in fact, in children, I think younger children, we need to counsel that they may require it to keep
I
the
do.
stabilization or constant. After maybe 7-8 years, they may require a
That's why parents counseling is most important in the pediatric cross-linking. And I have 3 to 4 patients which require the retreatment because they have very early, we treat them very early age, that is 8 or 9 years of the age, and they have a VKC very severe and they are eye rubber. And after 3 to 4 years, they are progress very fast, and we have to repeat the cross-linking in 3 to 4 patients.
So after that repeat cross-linking in both of your Dr. Nagpal, Rupal and Alicia, so did they stabilize? After that, you didn't have to, you found it was fine?
We have a follow-up after repeat Cithlia, we have a 2-year follow-up, and still they are not progressing.
Okay, so my question, I asked this question because, why it was one cross-linking, because most of the patients we were cross-linking were in, late teen or early 20s. So by that time, the collagen actually turns over and new collagen comes. So they are already near 30. But in kids, it's altogether different story. What we found, I have also seen, we have the youngest kid we have done cross-linking, I think was 4 or 5 years old. We did it under GA. And one child only we had to cross-link again. And that was done after 7-8 years. So maybe this is the collagen, as Sheetal rightly mentioned, that maybe the collagen turnover time that we need to keep in mind and keep watching. And then if there is an associated comorbidity like VKC, that will also be very significant.
I think that's an
Thank you so
important
much.
point in terms of counseling. Now that we know this, so now we also tell them that this will last for 8 to 10 years. We may need to repeat, although we hope not. Yeah, that's an important point to tell the patients now.
But all the children, they don't need it, Ashish. So I'm sure we all have done lots of kids. So why I ask this is, why, if it is a truth that 7-8 years a new collagen comes and the new collagen coming is a defective collagen, so you should need cross-linking in almost every kid.
Yeah,
But
so
why it doesn't happen?
it's a very guarded thing right now, because some of them may progress a little bit and then may remain stable. So then we don't go ahead and do it in them. So it's continuously, if someone is progressing and if they have been stable with their vision with the glass, then yes, only then.
And also maybe we also keep telling them that don't rub your eyes or be careful about that. Maybe that is also helping.
So you would think to question this idea of turnover. Okay.
What? Turnover of collagen.
You're okay. So you were pointing this for the questioning of this concept. Okay.
Yeah. Madam, आपका mute है.
In the meanwhile, I would request all to switch on their cameras, as we could take a screenshot before we end this session. All right, I'll take the screenshot in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the chairperson and the speakers for finishing it on time. We shall be getting started with the next session in exactly 4 minutes. This is the time where we wait for the next session speakers to come in, say hi to the speakers from the older session, and also be glad that the older session was over on time at the same time. I can see a big smile on Dr. Ashish's face. I think that's a good sign.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rupal, for organizing this very important topic. And thanks, Ashish, Alisha, Sheetal, and Nikhil. Thank you so much. I'm seeing you in many sessions. You are very particular timekeeper. Thank you so much.
It's my job to just be on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.